Good afternoon and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm James Carafano. I'm the Vice President for Foreign and National Security Policy at Heritage, and I am particularly excited to host this event for a couple of reasons. One is because of who our partner is. So, the National Association of Scholars does, I think, some of the most innovative, courageous, and important first order research in the United States today on some of the most important things that impact all of us, which are our educational institutions. We first partnered with them in their really groundbreaking work on Chinese influence in American universities and Confucius Institutes. And really, this was from somebody who did a literature survey of the Chinese impact on U.S. educational institutions. This was the first in-depth scholarly detailed, researched, documented work that was done either inside or outside of the U.S. government. And so, if you're not familiar with their work on the Confucius Institutes and on Chinese influence in American colleges and universities, I highly encourage you to get to the website and get a hold of their work. The report that we're going to talk about today, the company they keep, Organizational and Economic Dynamics of the BDS Movement, is absolutely up to the association's standards and importance. Anti-Semitism in the United States is not just a domestic issue, it's also a foreign policy issue. Domestically, it's not just an issue of religious liberty and fundamental rights, civil rights inside the United States, and the health of our civil society and the corrupting influence that anti-Semitism has on our institutions and on our culture and on our people. It's also a foreign policy issue because inexplicably, the issue of anti-Semitism is also a weapon and oftentimes intentionally weaponized to damage the relationship between the United States and Israel and to damage Israel's global reputation. So Israel is a global neighbor and citizen of great import to many friends and countries around the world. It's a critical ally of the United States, and it's an important and vibrant democracy. And anti-Semitism is it's kind of like COVID. If it doesn't kill you one way, it'll kill you another way, and it's absolutely a disease that has to be addressed head on. So I am absolutely thrilled to host the authors of this report to talk about the findings of their research. So the run of the show will be this. We're going to ask the authors in turn to come up and just introduce themselves because it's just faster that way. We can get to the meat of the things, and each talk for a few minutes, and then we're going to sit down and have a little fireside chat and wrap it up in about an hour. So thank you for participating in us, and I would ask you, if you are listening to this event today, when you see the link for this event, when the video is posted either on our website, on their website, share it. Share it on social media. Share it with your friends. No matter how many people watch or listen to us today, whether it's a few hundred or a few thousand, we need tens of thousands of people in the United States and around the world to see and hear about and access this information because it is critical. So anybody that ever had a thought about anti-Semitism, I know is evil, and it is something that I want to participate in fighting against, that this is your opportunity to do that by sharing the information you're going to hear about today. So with that, let me ask our authors to come up and speak, and then we'll have a little discussion. So over to you guys.
Just one bit of correction. I'm not an author. The author is Dr. Oxnevad here. I am actually Marc Greendorfer. I am the president of Zachor Legal Institute. I'm an attorney, and Zachor Legal Institute is a nonprofit legal foundation that fights BDS. So we are very interested in this report. We are very thankful for the National Association of Scholars and the Heritage Foundation for promoting this report because it is the essence of what we have been doing for the last roughly 10 years at Zachor Legal Institute. So one of the things that I want to start off with is to point out that there are many legal aspects to BDS. So first of all, under Title VI, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, BDS is unlawful. Under the National Labor Relations Act, BDS is unlawful. Under certain theories with regard to RICO, the racketeering law and material support to terrorism, BDS is a supporter of these terrorist organizations, and they should be censured as supporters of terror. What BDS is not is a matter of free speech. Courts have consistently now ruled this way. The Supreme Court recently rejected an appeal from the Eighth Circuit where the court found that the anti-BDS law that Arkansas had enacted was constitutional. And just, I think it was this week, the Fifth Circuit also ruled that an element of an anti-BDS law was constitutional. That element happened to be one of the recommendations from this report, which was to have states divest from companies that support BDS. So there are many legal aspects of BDS, and one of the problems is that we simply have a lack of enforcement in the United States of existing laws against BDS. Part of this is political. Part of it is because the other side, really backed by the ACLU, CARE, and other organizations, is so powerful in the way that they spread the narrative and the way that they use activists to oppose the existing laws and the enforcement of existing laws. So I'm happy to discuss some of the legal elements of this in the Q&A, but I just wanted to thank again the National Association of Scholars, Dr. Oxnevad, and the Heritage Foundation for promoting this report because it is critically important. As many have said, Jews are canaries in the coal mine for this country, and it's not just a Jewish matter. This is a matter of the foundations of this country. It's a matter of the fact that we are a nation founded on Judeo-Christian beliefs, and they are attempting through BDS, through all sorts of other social movements, to undermine that. And it's critically important. It's not just a Jewish issue, it is an American issue. So that's why I am here today. And I'd like to again thank everyone for being here and for paying attention and also for inviting me. Dr. Oxnevad. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I am the author of the report, The Company They Keep. The organizational and economic dynamics of the BDS movement. Just to sort of piggyback on what Marc said, you know, Israel is arguably Western civilization's origin and also its potential. It's a cohesive identity founded on transcendent values that are not confined to time or place. And it is also one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. Israel is at the cutting edge of innovation in everything from medical devices to the wireless technology that you're using now if you're watching remotely. So it's arguably what Western civilization has as a potential. So just to sort of spear point that, because you'll see why that factors into the findings of this report. So when I was tasked with looking at the BDS movement, I started doing a lot of research, and I found that there was quite a bit of work done on various snippets of it, but nothing that really spoke across lines. You had a few things on funding, you had discussions of ties to terrorism, you had policy issues, plenty of news stories about campus groups doing mock checkpoints and mock evictions in dorms, where you'd have pro-BDS students literally going into student dorms and knocking on people's doors and telling them that they had 24 hours to leave, to Apartheid Week, Israel Apartheid Week, and a number of campus antics. So what I saw was that there was no real dialogue between these different sources. So this report is fundamentally, on the one hand, designed to sort of put all of the dialogue and aspects of previous research in touch with each other, and also add some analytical weight to this by looking at, why does BDS pass on certain campuses and why it doesn't at others. So this report has a few components. The first deals with the campus level itself, right? So I look at a whole host of campuses, drawing on previous research and data that looks at success rates and failure rates on the BDS movement. And what I noticed is that the BDS movement's effectiveness, it depends on how you grade it, but in some ways it's incredibly successful, and in some ways it's a massive failure. And if you look at it, BDS has passed campus resolutions on at a number of schools across the country. The vast majority of schools in the U.S., colleges and universities, have no idea what BDS is. But where it is present, it has kind of a mediocre success rate in sort of getting actual initiatives passed. Now, I was curious to see what were the determining factors of why it actually succeeds in certain campuses and does not at others. So to do that, I looked at a number of case studies. I looked at Columbia University, University of California, Riverside, and Ohio State. And I discovered a number of things. So almost in every case, universities do not follow through with actual BDS demands. So even if a campus succeeds in passing a BDS resolution to basically pressure university endowments and retirement accounts and things like that to get them to divest from Israeli companies or companies that do business with Israel, no university has followed through with that despite campuses actually following through elsewhere, like divesting from private prisons or private sector prisons in terms of like contractors or the fossil fuel industry, things like that. BDS, on the other hand, no school administrator has ever followed through with that. But despite that, the resolutions nonetheless get passed. And I noticed a couple of trends in looking at these schools. One is that the success rate and the failure rate seems to entirely rest on the ability of pro or anti-BDS groups to coalition across issue lines. Now, if you look at the actual success rate, it's very, very low up until 2020. And then 2020, when you had, proliferation of social justice protests and riots, pro-BDS resolutions skyrocketed, and then they've dipped back down again. And what I looked at in the 3 case studies where I examined closely, Columbia University and UC Riverside, even at Ohio State, what I found is that the success rate pretty much relies on coalitioning of pro-BDS groups like the Students for Justice in Palestine across issue lines with other progressive groups. And conversely, at Ohio State, where resolutions were attempted multiple times, and it's failed to date at the student government level, anti-BDS groups run, the Ohio State's case was actually run by the Hillel chapter there. They actually worked across issue lines as well, built a very robust grassroots organizational effort, and succeeded in preventing its passage at the student level. So coalitioning across issue lines works. Now, while this is the campus level, there's a lot of questions about what animates this. How does this impact the outside, political debate, the political environment? How does this impact, Jewish students on campus, etc.? And it's pretty alarming. The actual outside of student government, the effects of the BDS movement are increasingly vocal and increasingly successful. The BDS movement now has an audience off campus in American political discourse today. You see this primarily on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Now, before I get into that, I want to talk about why BDS, and where it comes from. The BDS movement originates as an idea among pro-Palestinian activists and progressive activists from looking at South Africa in the 1980s and 1990s. Basically, they view that case as a successful case where boycotting, sanctions, and divestment efforts were successful in creating an alternative political outcome by the promoters of that effort. And some of the same individuals who founded BDS actually were involved in that effort as well when they were in grad school, on campus, etc. And the goals of that, right? So in 2005, you had the Second Intifada kind of winding down, and you had BDS as we know it today come to fruition in terms of a modern movement. And this, something to keep in mind, is actually an academic-led movement. The BDS movement itself, as we know it today, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, or PACB, was founded basically by professors. And while it is tied to terrorism through the BDS National Committee in the Palestinian territories, the BDS movement on campus and PACB and its U.S. offshoot, the U.S. Campaign for the Academic and Boycott of Israel, Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, or USACBI, those are all academic-led. Okay, so the idea that the BDS movement is somehow antithetical to academia, it's actually ingrained in it. That's, if you had to pick a sector of American society today where anti-Semitism is not only the norm, but lauded, it is in the modern university. So when looking at these universities and why they were effective at stopping it and why grassroots efforts sort of worked, it's important to keep in mind the economics of this. Now, the SJP chapters, the SJP, the Students for Justice in Palestine, which is the premier organization promoting BDS, it gets training from outside groups and legal representation, and those groups are incredibly well funded by tens of millions of dollars. And using public records and publicly available information, I document all that. The details are in the report. You're looking at $12 million from this foundation, $10 million from that foundation. Some of the names are familiar. Now, in sort of drawing, based on the case studies, what I found out is that there's a few things that can be done to sort of remedy the problem of BDS. Now, one of them is obviously drawing from Ohio State University's success is you have to build across coalitional lines, right? You have to build a new coalition that crosses boundaries. So I looked at what does work elsewhere and how it can be replicated. One of them is creating programs similar to Birthright Israel in order to cater to non-Jewish students, right? You have plenty of business-related, tech-related, and even religiously connected or interested organizations who would love a free trip to Israel. Now, why this is critical is that if you look at younger Americans, the majority of them don't know what the Holocaust is, in many cases, and they don't know the magnitude of it. And Israel needs legitimizing beyond just that, but it needs to actually be normalized as a regular country that other people have a connection to. And sort of this program to sort of replicate the birthright experience beyond just Jewish students is one way to do that. Now, while anti-BDS laws have been implemented in a number of states, roughly 35 or so, the laws that are in place should be amended to actually mandate Holocaust instruction on actually what happened during World War II and even before in the 1930s and the history of anti-Semitism in general, because the progressive narrative that Israel is somehow this aberration totally distorts reality and ignores the fact that there's archaeological and historical evidence linking the Jewish people to modern Israel that not only cannot be denied, but it actually is not just a reaction to the Holocaust. It was something that predates it by quite some time, 2,000 years or so. Countering the one-sided economics of on-campus Israel activism can be done through the creation of Abrahamic study centers. So in 2020, the Middle East as we know it basically ceased to exist with the normalization of relations between the UAE, Israel, and Bahrain. And if that was actually nurtured on today's academic campus, where you could have language programs, that are bilingual in Arabic and Hebrew, and you take students to both countries and actually create new centers that are not just explicitly devoted to obliterating Israel, but actually something productive, that would be one means of legitimizing this without stifling free speech. The pro-Israel side, the civil society, needs to actually have legitimizing mechanisms that are not based entirely on censorship. It has to create grassroots legitimacy, and that is one way to do that. And then anti-BDS laws need to be amended to penalize universities that offer funding to student groups who are entirely devoted to BDS and nothing else. The BDS movement is not fundamentally a Palestinian nationalist movement. It is an anti-Israel movement. And then anti-BDS laws need to be amended to mandate the divestment from universities who actually do divest from Israel, meaning that they will be penalized through their tax funding. And those are the recommendations from the report. The report has tons of detail. I encourage you to read it. We have plenty of case studies in there and documentation for future research. And thank you for having me.
Presentations. So I know this is kind of elemental, but if we just back up for a second, so particularly for our audience, if somebody had never heard the letters BDS ever before, just as a baseline, what would be your kind of 60-second elevator pitch on exactly what this is? And so would you both maybe take a stab at that?
So the BDS movement is the boycott, sanctions, and divestment from Israel, and it involves a basket of policies and initiatives promoted by activist groups that basically don't think Israel should exist as an entity.
Actually, I have a little bit different take on it. We've done a lot of research into what BDS is, and it is technically boycott, divest, and sanction. But what it really is it is a non-military alternative to warfare, and that's what the Palestinians and Marxists in general in the Middle East have found, is that they weren't getting anywhere with actual physical conflict. So they tried to weaponize other things: social justice, education, commerce, and that's what BDS really is. It's a continuation of the war against Israel from its founding as a modern state by non-military means.
So, we've heard the term lawfare, for example, like weaponizing the law basically to attack your enemies. And that people have turned the term hybrid warfare, which is this idea of little green men or different other ways or going after your enemies. But your point is this is actually a non-military way to attack another country. That's fundamentally what this is.
Yes, absolutely. And that's actually, there is a federal law that was enacted in the 1970s. It's under the, I think it was the EAA is what it's called. And the reason that it was enacted as the United States law as opposed to something in another jurisdiction is that they realized that the Arab League in the 1970s was using commerce as a way to engage in warfare against Israel. So, yeah.
And this is actually a good point, but if you're a classical realist, which is I am, right, and you have no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, and you're even a little sketchy sometimes on basic ethical issues, right? But you believe that fundamentally it is about what is in the best interest of your nation and your community. If you want to use America first or whatever, how does that fundamentally relate to us? And so the United States is a global power with global interests and global responsibilities. The three parts of the world that really knit United States to the larger global community, not about globalism or the UN or anything, but just so we can get around the world and do our business and look after our interests and our people, it is Western Europe, the greater Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. And what's interesting is, and this is just naked geopolitics, in every one of those regions, the United States has one country, which is the indispensable, indisputable, always reliable ally. And that is essentially America's anchor. It's the one place that no matter how good or bad things are, you can always go, you will always find a friend, and essentially it is the gateway. And in Western Europe, it's the United Kingdom. It's been the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States really since the outbreak of the Second World War. In Asia, arguably, it's Japan. In the Middle East, there's no question. It's Israel. And it's almost impossible to conceive of the United States as a power and influence in the region without this critical alliance to Israel. And it is incredibly significant also in part in our relations with Europeans, because this is an anti-Semitism issue they face as well. And they also recognize that it's weaponization. And I just want to add that, the one remarkable thing for me is I've been all over the world and I talk to all kinds of countries. And the interesting thing for me as an American, the first thing that they say when I go in the room is, we're a good friend of Israel, which I just think is really fascinating. The first thing they want an American to hear is that Israel is our strategic partner as well. So I want to bring this back to, I think is a really important question, again, for people who aren't maybe really steeped in this whole debate, is how is BDS anti-Semitism?
So you hear the retort that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. And, to kind of going back to this idea that activism is war by other means, to allude to Clausewitz, I would answer that retort with a question. You bring up Japan. Is it believable if someone says Japan should not exist? Japan has no legitimacy, should totally be obliterated. It's been there, that identity, thousands of years. It needs to be totally removed and reformed, would you actually believe that person if they said right afterwards that they're not anti-Japanese?
No, I mean, I think it's a really important point and somebody, when you've heard the term is, anti-Zionism, which is based, being anti-Israel, is not anti-Semitism, but yet, can you actually find a person who says that who isn't anti-Semitic and isn't anti-Israel, right?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So I want to go back to I think one of the fascinating things for me, in addition to reading the report, was the legal analysis that you offer that says, well, fundamentally, for all the posturing and everything else, this stuff is illegal, which is actually interesting because, we have that in common with many of the kind of woke campaigns that we see today, which is, we need to do this, we need to do that. And then they leave out the part where this fundamentally violates First Amendment rights. It fundamentally violates civil rights law to do this, right? For example, a lot of the anti-racism initiatives, if they were actually implemented, would actually violate civil rights laws, which were put in place to protect people's civil rights. So this whole notion that by the way, this entire campaign is illegal, could you unpack that a little more for us? And not just the kind of the legal explanation of why that's so, but also on why we don't actually enforce the laws on the books?
As for why, it's politics, obviously. Part of the problem is that we do have laws on the books. One of the most important ones, and it was really sort of supercharged by the prior administration when President Trump enacted an executive order under Title VI, is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and that prohibits discrimination in federally funded programs on the basis of race, national origin, and ethnicity, I think. But in effect, it basically says that you cannot discriminate in a federally funded program, such as education, against your students who are Zionist. And that's what President Trump's executive orders explicitly stated, is Department of Education, when you enforce Title VI, take into account the fact that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. So you would think at that point then, we've got the law, we've got the explanation from the president on why this should be applied. It should essentially stop all of campus activities because most campuses have some form of federal funding, and so they're subject to Title VI. Unfortunately, though, we have not seen enforcement of this law as amended by the executive order. I presently have 2 students at UCLA. Both complained of anti-Semitism on campus. Both were physically attacked. Both were, seriously harmed in their educational endeavors. One of the investigations is now in its 5th year. How long does it take to actually complete the investigation, conclude what's obvious, that there is anti-Semitism as part of these campus groups, and shut them down? They won't do it. So the question is, it's not really a legal question. There are plenty of laws out there. I mean, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act also is on its face violated by the academic boycott because it's national origin discrimination, and that's prohibited under Title VII. Why is it still happening? Because there are enough people on the left who are promoting it and supporting it and giving them a pass. The same ones, we deal with the ACLU a lot. They have a double standard. They will force a baker to bake a cake for a same-sex marriage, but they will not support anti-BDS laws that are meant to defend the rights of one of the most persecuted minorities on earth. So I don't know the answer to that. It's lack of fortitude.
Yeah, because I wanted to bring that to you. Where is the Department of Education, and where are state and local authorities, boards that are appointed by governors? Where are they in oversight on this issue? Did you see any evidence at all that the people that are responsible for enforcing the laws on the books or protecting the civil liberties of Jewish Americans or other people attending American universities? Why is this war happening almost with the U.S. government as kind of the bystander in chief?
So to answer that question, the first part, no, I don't see anybody really stepping in. I do think that the legal considerations are there for administrators. That seems to be a common theme. Once the BDS movement seems to reach that administrative threshold where there's a demand for the administration to do something at that specific college or university, they don't do it because they know it'll be violating some law, but that doesn't change the popular sentiment, right? And that's sort of the bigger question, is that we can debate laws all we want and try to enforce them. The problem is if there's no constant refreshing of legitimacy at the grassroots level and at the level of political discourse, the politics will change, then the laws will change, and that will change the outcome. So it's a bottom-up thing that has to be confronted. From the legal end, the administrators do seem wary of that. That's why they haven't followed through, obviously, on BDS divestment. You don't see any dumping of funds from retirement, institutional investing or anything like that. You don't see it. And the BDS movement also, it's not every single company. They actually do talk about their rationale. They cherry pick the companies that they want to target.
Right.
It's not just any company that does business in Israel. They go after specific companies for specific reasons. Maybe it's related to the construction of a settlement project. Maybe it's part of the high-tech industry that's connected to the IDF somehow. They pick companies for their PR value, their size, and things like that, knowing that if they can get one of them to cave, then others will follow suit. So it's not just a wholesale, we're going to, target Israel. They are very specific in who they target in terms of companies.
Yeah, I just want to underscore the point you just said, and make sure I understand it correctly, is it's almost like the university gets its cake and eats it too. It lets people be all vocal about these issues, but then they think, okay, but I'm not doing because I'm not actually going to implement any of that stuff, which is actually illegal. And what's missing from that is this is actually kind of typical with a lot of woke strategy, which in many ways is rooted almost in kind of the Marxist playbook, which is, yeah, it's okay, it's illegal. We know that but we're going to make this statement because what we're doing is we're undermining the legitimacy of the law.
Yes.
And at some point, the people will say, well, let's change the law. And that's really what's going on here, right?
Yeah, and that's where the BDS movement is succeeding. So while it's failing at the level of academic institutions and administrators not divesting, in terms of changing the discourse and the sentiment towards Israel and the legitimacy of attitudes towards Israel that have been prevalent up till now, it actually is succeeding. And you can see that generational, every layer you go down, a younger generation, the more pro-Palestinian they are. And it's not even, something to also bring up with the BDS movement is that the BDS movement is not actually pro-Palestinian. They're not advocating for investment in Palestinian companies. They're not investing in Palestinian civil society. It is explicitly anti-Israel. It has no constructive value on its own. Yeah. But that said, it is eroding the legitimacy, and it is changing the politics at the younger level, including among people who are pro-Israel. One study that I looked at going into the report, it was something like 40% of Jewish students basically agreed with the idea that it was okay to keep your mouth shut as long as you were socially accepted in the face of BDS. And that's pretty shocking. Columbia ranks as one of the most anti-Semitic campuses in the country, and at the same time, it has one of the highest levels of Jewish students attending at the same time.
Yeah, I don't think we can stress that point enough about the failure of leadership on the part of university leaders and on boards who think, well, this is really kind of a do no harm thing because I'm not going to do something that's going to get us sued or something else. But what they're actually doing is breeding a very destructive civil environment. And they are doing enormous damage by not having the leadership to stand up and fight against this. So which leads me to another point that I'd love for you to comment on. And then I also like it from the legal perspective is, so what you're describing about the legality aside, but in the public discourse is where inroads are made or where coalitions get together, almost like a rugby scrum, where the coalitions get together and they push this issue decisively on the university one way or another. And I'd like you to unpack that, describing that, because it sounds from the outside as the university is essentially a playing field, and it's become a place for weaponized political discourse and not an institution of learning and education. And as a person who's older than everybody in the room, except maybe that guy in the back there, but almost everybody else is, I remember the 1960s where universities were battle zones for the anti-war movement. And they weren't places of education. And the whole purpose was about people fighting over a political agenda. And the response of university leaders then was to hide in their offices. And then they would go, okay, we'll just hide. And when the war's done, we'll come out and we'll get back to doing the business of education. So could you unpack that a bit for us more to talk about this, how these coalition wars, how they're forming, who's engaging in them, how this is impacting universities? And then I'd love to again hear from where are the adults in the room, kind of in recognizing that this is all, regardless of your politics, this is absolutely sucking all the oxygen out of the room for actually educating the people that are paying to go to school here.
Yeah, so to kind of bring back something I found is that the BDS movement is predominantly academic-led. I would love to say that it was the brainchild of Hamas and then professors ran with it, but that's not the case. PACB was formed explicitly by professors, and they framed it in the way of the typical Marxist idea of settler colonialism, and a very well-known framework that has a very broad appeal on the left, including among a number of campus groups that are not even connected to the Israeli-Palestinian issue or the Middle East at all. And when you look at the coalitions that form where BDS is promoted, I mean, Arab and Muslim students are there, but they're not the weight of it. It's a very large, diverse array of left-wing student organizations. In some cases, some of them are Jewish, who are promoting it. And in terms of the actual professors, and one of the reasons that the administrators don't crack down is that this is an academic-led movement. The academia can't police itself in this regard because they created it.
You're nodding.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's actually, and it goes back to what you had said about during the civil rights protests in the 60s, that the professors were hiding in their offices. They're not hiding in the offices, they're behind this. And we know that because when we do for example, when students approach us and they tell us about what's happened to them, and as a prelude to a Title VI investigation, we do freedom of information requests, and we ask the universities to give us background information on what's going on. And in a lot of cases, you can see that the professors, and we've had cases where SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine chapters, are being advised by people on staff, like at UCLA. They are professors, they're getting paid for it, and then they're advising the SJP members on campus on how to do things and how to get away with things. They run interference for them. We've even had cases where we caught universities lying outright, that they say, no, we're not funding this event. For example, it was an SJP conference at UCLA. They said, we're not funding it, so it's not subject to Title VI. We do the freedom of information request. We find out, yep, they did fund it. They just simply lied. They had their general counsel lie to us. And the Department of Education simply sits there. They get the information. We send it to them. I've sent PDFs of these documents documenting that it's funded, and they do nothing. So, the legal aspects of this are immense, that we have universities, publicly funded universities, that are taking sides and that are actually advising students on how to discriminate and how to promote unrest and Marxism and terror in the United States. It's amazing, but it happens.
Well, I'm having not that I ever took LSD, because I never took those, but you have that recurring trip, because it does take me back to the 1960s, because it's an amazing parallel though, because the anti-war movement in the university in the 1960s started, again, not with students, it actually started with academics, particularly in anthropology departments, which were really the cultural origins of this. And it was really that, and tapping into the anti-draft protests where they really weaponize that. So it's almost like, it's the keeper of the keys, right? They're the one, the lunatics. It's not the lunatics that are running the asylum. It's actually the people running the asylum, and they're letting the lunatics all loose. Which gets back to the point here, which is, in terms of the battle on the university, well, the short-term answer is, our coalition of people fighting their coalition of people. Though the institutional structural answer is twofold. One is it's governance, right? So it should be the people running the university and the board of supervisors who are not just following the law, but are disciplining their own teachers and their own leadership about doing the right thing, and the departments of justice and attorneys generals and state, they should be the supporting, to give the backbone and support for these guys and girls to do the right thing. I want to take first of all, before we leave this about the war on the university level, what have we not talked about in terms of what's going on in colleges and universities today that we need to put on the table? Because I want to take it back to the foreign policy direction a bit, because you said something which I think is really important for people to understand. But so what are we not kind of hammered home on what's going on in universities?
Well, just to amplify one of the elements of the report and the recommendations, the important thing is that, as with everything, it runs on money and power. And what's happening right now is that the universities are allowed to really take sides and play favorites and engage in discrimination, and they're not being punished financially. And one of the recommendations from the report is a critical one, and that is, do not allow universities to spend public money on these radical groups, from whatever side they are. It's SJP in this context, but it's many other student groups that exist on campus, and they all get funded, and the universities cover it. They'll tell you, if you ask, no, it's not funded. We don't fund this particular group. It's not from student fees. But in the end, it's all about money, and the universities will respond when they don't get federal funding.
It's another important point there, because it also, again, parallels back to the other research that the National Association has done, which is on Confucius Institution Chineseism, where the Chinese show up with a boatload of money, and the universities just go along. So you have non-disclosure agreements. You can't tell people what the agreements you have. You have to file a Chinese law. You have to let us hire everybody. You have to have these programs. You can't question these programs. But as long as they're bringing in students or writing big, massive, huge checks, the universities are like, cool. And they've become kind of, is the job of a university to educate students to be better citizens, or is it to vacuum in as much money as possible?
Well, that's a great point, because we just finished litigation in Texas against Qatar, aided by Judicial Watch, and we won. And one of the things that we questioned was, we asked Texas A&M, tell us about the money you're getting from Qatar. Tell us about the contracts and the stipulations that come along with it. It was, it's a public interest thing. I mean, by definition. Qatar came to the United States. They spent hundreds of thousands, maybe more, to attack us, to go to court, to stop the production of these documents. And what we found is that Texas A&M willingly stopped reporting grants from Qatar at Qatar's request.
I got to add a few things to that. If you look at where the jackboots appear in history, it usually begins in books, and there's plenty of that going on in universities. Totalitarianism begins in the mind, and universities are actively manufacturing it. But going back to the idea of hoovering up money versus creating new citizens, there's a few things that need to be talked about. I mean, like with Confucius Institutes, because I wrote that one too. It's a top-down thing where China shows up with money. They offer the university prestige, international connections, in some cases, like a turnkey language program that they didn't have before. Right. And if you're a university in Kentucky or West Virginia, and all of a sudden a government's going to give you a boatload of cash, you're going to take it because it increases your prestige. And at the same time, the BDS movement, it's not coming from administrators, it's coming from professors primarily, and then you wind up with this institutional tension, right, between professors and and the administrators, and then the students who are being promoted by the professors to do this. But something to keep in mind too is just how the universities work. Are in teaching good citizens and creating good citizens versus actually teaching how to think independently. Teaching is not incentivized in our institutions. The goal of most professors is to get time off to write. It's not to actually to teach. Time in the classroom is not incentivized if you're trying to climb up the career ladder. Publications do it. And one way to get the time to do that is to bring in tons of money, give the students something to do, have them go away so they don't bother you during office hours, and then you can work on your thing, on your project. And that, unfortunately, that's not an ideological thing. That's just a professional problem in today's campus. We don't actually incentivize good teaching or good instruction. We substitute ideology for that, and then have the students go off and play while the professors actually try to do work, because that's what they want.
Well, it's not terribly surprising because educating is not tied to revenue, right? No. So if you're Coca-Cola, you make money the more bottles of Coca-Cola you sell. In a university, you don't make more money by better educating people. You have guaranteed federal student loans, so you have a guaranteed source of income. And then we forgive the student loans so that people are encouraged to take more student loans out. And then when the cost of education goes up, we just give out bigger student loans. And on top of that, you can go to any foreign country that you want and bring in that money, or anybody. And so if you want to I don't begrudge either public or private universities for wanting to make money, but the way you make money is you give people what they want. And giving people better education isn't going to get you more money, right?
No.
I want to kind of go back to something you said and take this back to the foreign policy issue, because let's say you're not like me and you're a cold-blooded, heartless realist, and you just care about American interests, and you actually care about the people of Palestine as I think it is a really important point to discuss that the BDS movement does nothing to make their life better. And it's a reflection actually of not just of Palestinian leadership, but the influence and control of the Palestinian polity, which has nothing to do with the interests or the betterment of the people of Palestine. So for example, there's an enormous amount of Iranian influence and Iranian money. That Iranian influence and money is not there to make life better for the Palestinians. It's to destroy Israel. If you look at the groups that run, they're primarily interested in, not much different than Columbia or Harvard, making money. And the money comes through the foreign influence, the corruption, the control of foreign aid, money that comes through places like UNRWA, controlling that money, controlling the power and the resources, and benefiting the lives of the Palestinian people is far down the list. And so I can't, the number of people I've talked to, Palestinians whose lives are destroyed because they would, I have Israeli customers. Well, that's not allowed, right? You can't do business with Israelis. You can't benefit yourself. And so they're dramatic, not only their political liberties, but their economic activity is suppressed, specifically to weaponizes the war against Israel, and their betterment is the last thing in line. And so, can you again explain how BDS actually is a detriment to the average life of a Palestinian family? How this actually makes their life worse by supporting this program?
Yeah. So the economies, the Israeli and the Palestinian economy are so integrated, it's almost impossible to talk about them separately. And people, you have Palestinians who work at Israeli companies. They get paid in shekels. They're fully integrated into the Israeli economy. So if you're boycotting an Israeli company, right? Like you talked about I didn't go into corporate boycotting. I didn't talk about the corporate world in the report, like Ben and Jerry's, for example, where they refused to sell in parts of Israel and the West Bank and things like that. Ironically, that was actually a boon to local ice cream makers because the local ice cream is pretty good. Yeah. But most of the time, that's not the case. You're just destroying the economy. You're not actually building anything. The BDS movement has never held a big rally to build a hospital, to create job programs, or to do anything like that. It is explicitly just funding anti-Semitic, anti-Israel programs. It doesn't actually contribute anything to the average Palestinian family.
Yeah. And not to let the Israeli government off the hook to be fair, the Israeli government sometimes encourages and empowers this, right? They're the first people to say, oh yeah, give the money, the U.S. taxpayers should give money to UNRWA to go to the Palestinians. They know that money isn't going to get to the Palestinians to help them, that it's just empowering the people who are in charge and essentially buying them off, right? So, the really question is right, who really speaks for the Palestinian people? Who really has their interests at heart? Where is the civil society or the governance that actually says, no, my job here is to let these people live a decent life in their own communities? I mean,
the problem is that BDS, as the report indicates, is a Marxist revolutionary movement. It is not a civil rights movement. It's not even a nationalist movement. It is simply there to attack and destroy an institution, which happens to be a state and a people, that is in the way of Marxist ideology. One of the best examples I have of what you're getting at, which is, if we had spent the money, or if the Palestinian side had spent the money and effort on BDS to actually improve the lives of Palestinian Arabs in the land, things would look dramatically different. I was in Israel, I think it was last year. I was walking through the old city, and I was going actually to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So it was in a Christian Arab part of the city, and one of the vendors flagged me over. He wanted to sell me something, and I didn't really want it. And we started to talk, and he said, my family has been here for 400 years. And I said, oh yeah? What happened before 400 years? And he looked at me and I said, I'm Jewish, and I think that you are on my land. And I said it in a nice way, but I said, this conflict is not just 400 years old, it's thousands of years old. And at that point, he didn't want to talk anymore. But that's really, to me, the essence of this problem is that BDS really is, as this report really strongly indicates, it is not a positive movement, it's a negative movement. And it's not trying to improve anyone's life, it's just trying to destroy something.
To kind of add to that, one thing I noticed was how little of the BDS movement is actually coming from the Middle East, and how much of it is, it's essentially a Western academic, progressive-led movement. It is not a Middle Eastern one. I was waiting for the big shock of finding, Iranian money or,
right.
things like that, and I didn't. I didn't find any. It was predominantly, overwhelmingly left-wing, academic-led movement from the West. It was not from the region, and at the same time, there are. So the question is do these activists actually have the interests of the Palestinians at heart when they're not even there? They're rebel rousing from abroad. That's not actually building anything. And you do have, 2019, I was here at a Middle East Studies conference, and there was a presenter who was an economist, and he was talking about these sort of pre-planned communities that Palestinians are forming. They're pre-planned cities, like they're gated. I was taking pictures of it. It looked like a sci-fi novel. And these people work in Israel. They live in these communities. And it seems so far removed from what we normally see. And if that's really the case, and that's becoming the norm, where people just want to move on with their lives, and I think the Abraham Accords sort of allude to this. Mm-hmm. We can do business together. We don't have to push each other off of this patch of land, et cetera. There's very strong historical arguments for every party there that they have claim to it. I mean, how far back do you want to go? 700 years, 1,500 years, 2,000 years. At the same time, can you coexist? And I think there's elements of that starting to say yes. But coexistence is not the same thing as obliteration, and it's a different thing that's happening organically, right, as opposed to the BDS movement, which is not organic at all. Right. It is explicitly fostered and manufactured to obliterate one side.
Right. And to bring that back to kind of selfish, evil American interest, right? The idea of integration in the Abraham Accords of not just Palestinians, Israelis, but Arabs and Israelis, living together. It's not just this kind of Pollyannish. Wouldn't it be nice if we can all live in a community, which is great. I'm all for that. But from the cold-blooded realist in me, the economic, political, security, diplomatic integration in the Middle East is not just transformative for the people. It will actually be finally the engine that creates jobs and creates peace in the region. But it's in our interest because a peaceful region is better for the United States, and it's a bulwark against transnational Islamist terrorism. It's a bulwark against Iran. It's a bulwark against Chinese. It's a bulwark against the Russians.
To add to that, because you're a cold-blooded realist and I'm a neoclassical realist myself.
We can still date.
I couldn't
okay.
say, yeah. We'll get a drink after this. But to sort of drive that home, the geopolitics of this, to kind of clue in China, because that's something we're known for at NAS now. The BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, everyone's focused on the Indo-Pacific, Pacific Rim. China's not coming west. They're going east.
Right.
Or they're going west, rather, across Eurasia.
They're going to the easy places.
They're going the easy places. Right. And the way to block that, historically, if you want to, force them, into Russia exclusively, if you want to blunt the BRI, it has to be in the Middle East.
Right.
And that's something that's not getting talked about.
Right.
If you want to blunt China, you need strong relationships, not only between American partners in Israel and the Gulf, and hopefully Turkey again at some point. Yeah. But they need to have good relationships with each other to create an alternative to the BRI, potentially with an American ally like India. Sort of an Indian Ocean, Middle East-centric version of that.
And we have to wrap because I got to tell a super quick story. So I actually did a U.S., India, Israel trilat, which was really funny. This is a couple years ago.
Now we need definitely date.
Well, so the funny thing is, so from the Indians who were trying to reorient on the importance of the Middle East, who traditionally had just looked at this through the Iranian perspective, they were like, okay, what's the banks again? It's like, and the Israelis were kind of aghast that they just didn't understand the very basic fundamentals of what was going on in Israel. And why can't you guys get along with the Lebanese and the Syrians? But the funny thing is then the Israelis started talking about the Chinese. This was back when they were a little more naive, and they said, well, yeah, they're going to come in and invest in that. And the Indians were like, what are you guys nuts? You're going to let the Chinese in here? So it is just really important point. And we just have a minute or two, but I do want to bring this back home to wrap this up and give you each a last comment here. Because what's interesting is about everything you discussed, it is all literally out of the playbook of cultural Marxism. And Marxism is fundamentally about accumulating power. And it is not about creating a people's utopia. It is about creating and holding on to power. And cultural Marxism is a tool for weaponizing that. Now, I don't know if all these guys, if the Chinese and the leftist professors are in this together, or they're just happen, to get the same, Evil Dead playbook and they're reading the same spells. But the reality is what we see in BDS movement, what we see in Chinese Confucius Institutes, what we see in a lot of woke things are people using the same playbook. It's not really about justice. It's not really about fairness. It's not really about empathy. It is about a tool to take power. And it is a far greater threat to our civil society, to our prosperity, to our democracy, to our economic growth, to our security than is commonly acknowledged. And when people say, well, this is cultural Marxism, they say, well, you're the guy that, there's a boogeyman under the bed or hiding in the closet, and not really recognizing that this is actually the weaponization to destroy the system that we have. And if I'm wrong, then let me know, but because I want to give you guys kind of each a last 60 seconds to kind of just wrap it up on your thoughts.
I think the biggest problem, right, whether we're talking about Confucius Institutes or other issues with academia or the BDS movement, is as a profession, we've lost what it's about. We talk about cultural Marxism. Everyone talks about what that the boogeyman's real. It results in Maoist revolutions and killing fields. I think that's clear. But we don't talk about what needs to be there instead. And once upon a time, you know, academia used to be the place where you would learn how to think freely and pursue the good, right? It's probably a foreign term to most people because it's so rare now on college campus to hear that. Or the good is the notion that the human being can achieve the highest thing possible. And that's predicated on a few things like transcendent human value, the ability to reason, and the idea of an objective truth, or that certain natural laws are external to any government or any individual person or power. That comes from the Greeks. It also comes from Judaism. You know, and that's ultimately one of the reasons why the BDS movement and the left hates Israel so much, because it threatens their entire conception of the world in a way that makes sense to them.
Can you give us one quick last thought?
Sure, yeah. One of the things that I've noticed is that I'm a first-generation American. My mom's was a Holocaust survivor. And so this country is something special to me. One of the reasons that I do this work is that it's not just about the Jewish people. It's about the concepts of liberty and justice and fairness. And that's what this country does more than any other country on the face of the earth in history. What BDS is about, and it's backed by the Marxist, whatever you want to call it, eminence Greece, whatever. What they're trying to do is they are trying to destroy this country, and they do it in very specific ways, attacking Israel, an ally of the United States, and really, the best representation of ideas of liberty and justice. A lot of our current systems come from Judaic thought, and you walk through DC and you see that, the Supreme Court versus the Wailing Wall. I mean, all of these are very important monuments that they are attacking. And they're not attacking just monuments, they're attacking ideas, they're attacking structures. And that's why people need to pay attention to BDS, because it is definitely, as I said before, the canary in the coal mine. It is not going to end with just eliminating Israel as a state.
Yeah, well, I want to thank our presenters. Before we leave, I do want to implore you to go to the National Association of Scholars website, download the report, share the information, share the video today. Don't just be a passive observer in this debate. Please be an active participant, because it is fundamentally important to the future of not just the United States, but all people that share this idea of the freedom and prosperity and security of their own citizens. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching.
Thank you. Go.